Good morning, men. My name is Pastor Carlos Malley. I'm the outreach pastor of the Circle Church of Alexandria, located in Alexandria, Louisiana, here for another episode of Manhood Monday. Today, we wanted to talk about the topic of lust. It's a very difficult topic to talk about, but it's one that we as men certainly need to hear. I'm going to be reading a text out of Matthew's Gospel. It's going to come from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5, verses 28. Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5, verses 28. And I'm reading this morning from the New King James Version. And it says, "But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." You know, I am reminded of a story from the Old Testament where David is on the balcony and he looks at a beautiful woman by the name of Bathsheba. And when he sees this woman, he instantly starts to lust after her in his heart. And that lust transitions from lust to actual adultery. But this scripture teaches us that the moment that David began to lust after Bathsheba in his heart, he had already committed adultery. But let's think about, when you reflect back on that story, what were the actions that happened after he lusted after Bathsheba in his heart? The first thing was he summoned her. Some biblical scholars argue that he raped Bathsheba because, here he was, the king of Israel. She was, Uriah, the Hittite's wife, a captain in his own army. And, for her, did she feel powerless? We don't know that. But again, some scholars argue that David actually raped her. The second thing that happened was he actually slept with Bathsheba. He committed adultery with one of his own captain's wives. So I'm a military chaplain. And a big issue that goes on in the military is adultery. Is a man or a woman goes and deploys defending the freedoms that we enjoy in this nation for 6-9 months. And while they are gone, their spouse, male or female, may have cheated on, committed adultery. Why? It stems from lust in the heart. Well, this is exactly what happened with Uriah. He is out fighting, and his own king, or we would say his own president, sleeps with his wife while he is out defending the freedoms and fighting for the nation of Israel. And so, number one, some scholars say he raped her. Number two, he actually sleeps with one of his captain's wives. Number three, he tries to cover it up. He tries to cover up his sin that he has committed against Uriah, against himself, against Bathsheba, against God. And so he calls him back and tries to get him to go and sleep with his own wife. But Uriah, a man of integrity, said, "How can I go and sleep in my own house and sleep with my own wife when my men are still out fighting for our nation?" And so Uriah exercised high moral character, and he also exercised integrity by not sleeping with his own wife, which he had every right to do at that moment, right? That was his wife, but he decided not to do that. And so because David wanted to ensure that his sin remained a secret, he ordered that his own captain be killed in war, to put him in the most fiercest area of battle to ensure that he would die. And he did. Uriah is essentially killed at war. And then not only did David have him killed at war, but David now takes Uriah's wife and makes her his own. Now, back then, they practiced polygamy in that culture. That was common practice. But he took Bathsheba to be his own. And so let's just think about that. He lusted. It started all from lust, everyone. He lusted by what he liked, what he saw. Then he essentially took her and was intimate with her, had sex with her. Some scholars again argue that he raped her. Then thirdly, he tried to cover his sin up. And then fourthly, because he couldn't cover it up because of Uriah's integrity, he had Uriah murdered and killed, his own captain and his own army. But the prophet comes, and Nathan the prophet comes, and he confronts David. And he said, how can you commit this egregious sin against God? He uses this example of a rich man owning, lots of things in terms of lambs, sheep and cattle and things like that. And there was one person who had this little small lamb, and this man takes that one lamb from his servant. He said, and David says, well, that man should be killed. And Nathan says, you are that man. You are the man that took Uriah the Hittite's wife and made her your own. And not only that, you killed him and covered it up to cover up your sin. And so I want to just go back and say that all of that happened as a result of David lusting after Bathsheba. Now, we know in scripture that David repents. We see in Psalms 51 how he laments and he repents over the sin that he has committed against God. And God forgave David. It says that David was a man after God's own heart, but it didn't take away the consequences. It didn't take away the consequences of everything that David faced. He was a king. He was a king who was constantly at war. He was a king that was in civil war where his own son tried to take his kingdom. He was constantly being pursued to be killed. And his daughter was raped by her own brother. So the consequences of his choice, it never left him. It followed him until he took his last breath. And so I want to remind us today that story of David is a story that is very common amongst us as well, that we as men oftentimes, and we were even taught this in the Army, called the Bathsheba syndrome, where God gives you a little bit of power, he gives you a little bit of influence, and you forget about all of that in order to fulfill the lust of the flesh. We talked about that this weekend, the works of the flesh versus the fruit of the spirit. And I want to warn you guys this morning, man, that don't ruin your life. Don't ruin your marriage. Don't ruin your family. Don't ruin your career. Don't ruin all the things that God has blessed you with over a one time, or if that's you right now, you're in an inappropriate relationship where you shouldn't be involved in right now. I encourage you to stop it. David thought that what he did would never be exploited, and it was. Eventually it was. And how I've seen throughout history, so many powerful people fall, not because of their ability and what they're doing in their position of influence, but because of a moral decision that they made that they in turn regret, that results in them ruining their lives, their families, their careers, their businesses, and you can just go down the gamut of the list of things. And so I want to encourage us. That was a tough message for Pastor Smith to preach yesterday, and it's tough for me to even say it, but that's why accountability is important. You need an accountability partner that will hold you accountable, so that you and I and we, because none of us are exempt from this. I'm saying this to you this morning, but I'm saying this to all of us this morning. Get in a good Bible-based church. Stay in your word. Resist the devil when he begins to tempt you with your flesh. Follow the fruit of the Spirit. Walk in the fruit of the Spirit. Get in an accountability group where you are accountable to other men to prevent you from making a decision that you're going to regret in the long run. I haven't even mentioned STDs. I haven't even mentioned, things that, you just can't bring back. And so I encourage you this morning, men, it's not to judge you, it's to love you. And I pray that if you listen today, that this message warns you that if you're thinking about doing this, or you're thinking about being in any type of inappropriate relationship, don't do it. Don't do it. Pastor Outline and I advocate today that the only relationship that you can be in an intimate nature is one in biblical covenant marriage between a man and a woman. Biblical covenant marriage between a man and a woman. Anything outside of that, Scripture calls sin. And so don't get caught up in that, men, today. And I encourage you, I love you. If you're struggling, men, reach out to me, reach out to someone else, and we can get through this together, man. All right. And so I always want to leave you by saying, follow me and I will make you fishers of men. I pray that word blessed you today. Guard your heart, for it is the wellspring of life. Don't get caught up and ruin all that God has blessed you with over this one thing. David was king. He could have had anything that he wanted. All he had to do was ask of God. And Scripture says, and I want to end with this, when you read Matthew's gospel in the very beginning, when he talks about the genealogy of Jesus Christ, Uriah the Hittite is listed as Bathsheba's husband. She is listed as the wife of Uriah the Hittite because of his spiritual integrity. She is not listed as David's wife. And so please be mindful that what we hold on to as men is our legacies. And we want to leave a sound, positive legacy for our sons, for our daughters, and for our future. So I pray that word blessed you today. You take care until we meet next time. God bless.